what we can do to be safe in the coming season. So next slide, please. Just a couple housekeeping things. Again, please mute yourself when you're not speaking and use the chat to communicate. I'm glad to see folks are sharing what clubs they're with. That will really help us, and we're delighted actually to welcome those of you who have not been here before or who are from an area that we haven't had participate before. So thank you. And we also will use the chat to take your questions. So do put any questions in the chat. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little background, the Zonta USA Caucus started to create this think tank after Zonta Said Now had started in Australia. And it is one of our 6 committees. And of course, our mission is to build a better world for women and girls through advocacy and through education and awareness. And this event is really to share with us awareness of different aspects of climate change and how it affects women and girls in particular. You can see our committee has members from most all of our districts. We are missing District 6 and I think 10. So if you know of anyone in those districts who is keen on changing the impacts of climate change, please invite them to come to our next meetings. Many of the presenters today are from our committee and will be covering different areas of expertise. So next slide, please. And I'll just go a brief background over what the caucus is. Created in 2018, we are now 6 years old, and we were created to form a mechanism for the Zonta clubs and districts in the US to unite to support Zonta International's mission. And our goal is to do service and advocacy in the United States at both the national and the state level. It is a place for us to align on our key issues, which we do decide every biennium, and provide a platform for coordinated advocacy actions throughout the United States and provide opportunities for the clubs to participate in those. So that's who we are, and that's why we're here today. And next slide, please. At this point, I will turn it over to Connie to take us on our journey.
All right. Thank you, Bobby. So I will be running the slideshow today, and I wanted to show you our agenda, starting with climate change, the impacts of heat and health, as well as specific heat-related topics, maternal child health, elderly, cooling stations, wildfires, fresh water, soil, and harvest. And we'll go into some brief Q&A discussion and followed up with what Zontans can do. So now I'm going to turn it over to Angela.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. One of the things that when we start talking about climate change that we've heard about for quite some time is how everything's getting warmer. The earth is heating up. And with the earth heating up, that has major impact for many aspects. The way we live, our crops, the health of our soil, our pets, everything. And I don't know how many people might have seen CBS's Good Morning America today, but they actually had a very interesting discussion about the heating up of the climate and how Alaska is the fastest heating state we have, followed by Arizona. And the impacts of this is just, it affects everything, all the ecosystems, all the biodiversity that we have. Next slide, please. So as the climate continues to heat, we are quickly reaching the 1.5 degree limit that we've set as a goal. With the unusual hot temperatures, we have more unstable summer weather. The steady rise of temperatures is one thing, but then when you add with that the heat wave aspects that we have, which become more and more frequent and more intense. With each heat wave, we see a higher risk of related illnesses, and we also need to be mindful of the effect that all this heat does on our pets, our outdoor pets. Hospitalizations rise. For me, it's always the water resources. What's going on? Where is our availability? Do we have accessibility? And then after that, for me, it follows into how's it affecting our gardens, our growth, our food support? Next slide, please. Most people are aware that once we have sporadic heat waves, all the weather, or I'm not the weather, all the newscasters talk about the increase in violence. So there is a direct correlation between high temperatures and hot tempers. We see more violent actions, more crime, more physical assaults. And on this slide, you can see that, you know, this is not just in the US. You have South Asia, you have Kenya, you have Madrid, and you have the USA. So as we continue to deal with the rising temperatures, we have to be prepared for the effect it has psychologically on all of those around us. And on that, I'm going to pass it to Daniela, please.
And I am going to be talking about heat-related topics. And next slide. So according to the World Health Organization, climate-sensitive health risks are disproportionately felt by the most vulnerable and disadvantaged populations. This includes women, children, minorities, poor communities, migrants and other displaced peoples, older populations, and those with underlying health conditions. In this presentation, we will hear what some of the biggest impact is on our most vulnerable populations, including the impacts of warm weather-related climate events on maternal, child, and elderly health. Next slide, please. So when we think about warm weather disasters and climate-related events, we have to first think about the risk factors. Social determinants of health play a large role in how quickly certain populations can recover from climate-related and extreme weather-related events. An individual or family that faces poverty is disproportionately and adversely impacted by climate-related weather events. One of the many reasons there is risk for low-income communities is due to the lack of financial resources, human network and relationships, limited community infrastructures, and higher levels of social isolation. Some communities are also more susceptible to health disparities than others, including that of the low-income community, the elderly community, and people of color. The health disparities experienced are often exacerbated during extreme weather events, and these can include asthma, lung issues, and cardiovascular issues, which have the highest rate among Black and African Americans. Adaptive capacity, as seen here, refers to how resilient a community can be after an adverse event occurs. A strong adaptive capacity has infrastructure support and resources in place to respond to and adapt to impacts of these adverse events. Those without it or with low adaptive capacity either must evacuate, relocate, and or recover from health issues that may occur post-adverse event. And an example of this would be a family having to return to their home after a flood or hurricane with black mold present and not having resources to seek a healthy living environment elsewhere. Climate change impacts health both directly and indirectly and is strongly mediated by environmental, social, and public health determinants. The World Health Organization predicts that over the next decade and onward, from 2030 to 2050, 250,000 deaths per year, climate-related deaths per year, will occur. And this can be attributed to the lack of potable water, illnesses such as diarrhea and malaria, malnutrition, and heat stress. It should be noted that climate-related events have led to radical changes in vulnerable communities, not good radical changes. These include death, forced migration, and diminished resources. Next slide, please. Next slide.
Connie.
Yeah, I know. I'm having issues here.
Okay.
Hold on. I don't know why it's sticking. I'm going to go out and come back in again. Try that. There we go.
There we go. Okay. So in order to discuss vulnerable populations, we must address the disparities in maternal health, especially the ones that occur in the United States. I'm sure many of you have heard the headlines about our high mortality rate in maternal health. So according to the CDC, the maternal mortality rate for 2021, which was the last data that was recorded, was 32.9 deaths per 100,000 live births. Of those, which is up from 23.8 and 20.1 in 2022 and 2019 respectively. We have to think about those deaths that often are related to climate related events, whether it is due to weather, extreme heat, the inability to access healthcare due to these events, or the lack of access to resources as mentioned in the previous slide. And then to make matters even worse, the hardest hit communities are non-Hispanic, Black, African American women, with the death rate in 2021 of 69.9 deaths per 100,000. Additionally, we see these things and we can see that extreme weather and hot weather, there's a rise in Zika and malaria. Zika and malaria can have impacts on fetal development. Malaria can specifically cause low birth weight, preterm birth, and miscarriage, while Zika can severely impact brain development and damage other parts of the body, including joints, eyes, and muscles. While they're not very common in the US, as of August 2023, there were a total of 9 malaria cases locally acquired in Texas, Florida, and Maryland. Zika was last seen and reported in the US between 2016 and 2017 in Florida and Texas. However, with both travel to warm weather countries and the rise in global temperatures, there's still a risk for these and other vector-borne infectious diseases that can impact individuals in the US and globally. And then after a climate event or even multiple climate-related events occur, women and children, even all individuals, can be exposed to harmful environmental hazards. This includes black mold, debris, contaminated water, and poor air quality, leaving expectant mothers vulnerable, but also increasing the likelihood of the preterm births, postpartum complications, lower birth weights, where the babies are small for gestational age. And when climate change is in the forefront, it can have a lasting impact on mental health. Women are likely and in higher numbers to experience depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and increased stress during this time in the postpartum period and during climate-related events. This can then lead to intergenerational trauma, which increases the higher likelihood of children experiencing higher scores of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And then women and children will face the biggest burden of climate change, which will lead me to my next topic, children. Next slide. Lastly, I want to focus on child health. So it's predicted that over 80% of the burden of climate change will fall on children. Access to quality resources serves as a reminder to the relationship between the child's health and the environment that they live in. As discussed, it is predicted that over the next 2 decades, an estimated 250,000 climate-related deaths per year will occur. It is likely that the majority of those deaths will be children, with the most vulnerable children being under the age of 5. Children are at increased risk of biopsychosocial problems in addition to physical problems that come with climate change. It's predicted that due to a child's metabolic rate, they will consume more air pollutants and contaminated water, putting them at increased risk for illnesses related to climate change. A child's cardiovascular and respiratory system can be impacted by the particulate matter, exposing them to ammonia nitrate, black carbon, and ground level ozone, nitrates, and sulfates. When these matters are considered, we want to think about them as the fine particles. So that is anything defined as less than 2.5 milliliters. It has a high likelihood to cause lasting impacts to the lungs. Additionally, we are seeing increase in dermatological conditions, mental illness related to climate change, so increase in anxiety and suicidality. And we are also seeing a trend with warmer temperatures that cause an increase of insect diseases and vector-borne diseases, including tick and Lyme diseases. Heavy downpours create waterborne diseases, especially among children who rely on private water wells. fires like we saw this past summer, which produce an immense amount of smoke, reducing air quality and posing several severe health risks for children, especially those vulnerable to respiratory diseases such as those with asthma. And we also are seeing infections coming earlier or lasting longer and increasing in intensity due to the change in temperatures. And then there are other emerging risks occurring in new places because of temperature and rainfall changes. Now I'll pass it on to Joyce, who will talk about the impacts of health on elderly. Next slide.
I don't see Joyce on at the moment. I think she's had some issues with her computer, so I'll go ahead and present for her.
Actually,
Next slide.
Angela, I actually have her notes.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, here we go. So older adults are more likely to have health conditions that make them more sensitive to climate hazards like heat and air pollution, which can worsen their existing illnesses. Many older adults have limited mobility, increasing their risks before, during, and after an extreme weather event. Aging and some medications can change the body's ability to respond to heat. This puts older adults more at risk for heat illnesses and death as the climate warms. Many older adults have compromised immune systems, which make them more prone to severe illness from insect and water-related diseases that may become more common with climate change. Older adults may depend on others for medical care and assistance with daily life, increasing their vulnerability to extreme weather events. It is estimated that extreme heat contributes to over 1,300 deaths per year in the United States. Symptoms include mild swelling, rash, cramps to potentially deadly heat exhaustion and heat stroke, dizziness, nausea, hydration, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, all of which can lead to death. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Terry.
Hi, I'm Terry Pertestein from the Zonta Club of Maricopa in the Arizona, Phoenix area. Anyway, we're going to talk about cooling stations today. Next slide, please. Cooling stations are where people can go to get out of the heat if they don't have any air conditioning or cooler places at home. Some of the likely places are churches, community centers, public libraries, malls, museums, restaurants. You can see all that there. Movie theaters. Anyway, cool environments during the heat waves help people to avoid the worst threats and can save lives. But cooling centers only help if the most at risk are able to access them, which requires people to know about their location, have access to these heat cooling centers, and have things to do while there, and overcoming the stigma of thinking that cooling centers are only for poor or elderly. There are some cooling centers that have some limitations as far as the hours of operation. Some of them are only open during the workday. Because of these limitations, cooling centers can't be the only solution. Combating heat involves a multi-layered approach, including parks and tree canopies, white roofs, and energy-efficient practices to relieve pressure on the power grid. Next slide, please. Okay. Why do we need cooling stations? For many of the reasons I just mentioned, but to avoid the heat, protect vulnerable people, and for people without air conditioning, fans, electricity, and so forth. There are some tips to stay safe in the heat. Try and find a shelter from the heat whenever possible. Drink plenty of water and eat small, frequent meals. Avoid strenuous activities. Check on vulnerable friends, relatives, and neighbors. Never leave children or pets inside a vehicle. And then you might want to keep any medications. Many are affected by heat. So try and put those in a cooler area. Next slide, please. Well, being that I live in the Phoenix area, in a suburb, we thought this would be good because Phoenix has been in the news so much over the last few years because of all the extreme heat. As I mentioned, they have public cooling stations. They have volunteers that urge residents to sign up via text or phone calls for the cooling stations to let them know where they are and how they can be used. They can tell them where they are nearby to the person that they're calling. And Phoenix is a contributor to the Heat Relief Network, which provides information about cooling stations and how to beat the heat in 200 locations in Arizona. There's an interactive map on the Maricopa Association of Governments Heat Relief Network website. You know, that's a long one, but anyway, they list the locations for hydration stations and cooling centers. The Heat Relief Network provides information about the hydration stations, refugee locations, and water donation sites throughout the valley. And Phoenix is surrounded by mountains, but we are in a huge valley. And that's why our heat is so much worse. A lot of people go up to the mountains for the summer. Each year, the Maricopa Association of Governments coordinates the mapping of the Heat Relief Network. Their interactive maps may show collection or donation sites where you can, water bottles can be donated, and they also have hydration there. Some sites do accept the other donations such as clothing, hats, and toiletries, but you need to check with them to see if all of them receive that. The hydration station sites are locations where individuals can go to receive bottled water and other collected donated items. It can be either inside or outside. Cooling centers, they're indoors, have air conditioning. Respite centers are also air conditioned, and they offer hydration and rest. And then lastly, pools and splash pads are good ways to cool off. The Arizona Department of Health Services website also has an interactive map showing the locations of statewide cooling centers, respite centers, and hydration stations where you can find shelter and water across Arizona. Now I'm going to turn this over to Joanne.
Thanks, Terry.
You're welcome.
My name is Joanne Gallos, and I am with District 3 Zonta and also the Zonta Club of Annapolis, Maryland. We know that climate problems are increasing, even though there are some who still deny that, surprisingly. You want to, next, thanks. Extreme heat and wildfires result in loss of income, loss of food, and often loss of homes. Air pollution is a result of many climate problems, but recently from smoke from fires around the world. People with lung problems and with asthma are at higher risk, as are children and pets with their smaller lungs. Results are loss of income and health issues. According to the World Health Organization, WHO, some of the world's most populated cities are Karachi, Pakistan, New Delhi, India, Beijing, China, Lima, Peru, and Cairo, Egypt. Relocation from fires often results in loss of income, loss of homes and health, and unfortunately, lives. And as Zontans have learned, forced relocation often results in increased violence against women and girls, increased sex trafficking, and too often early marriages to older men. What we really are talking about and what we are focusing on today are the women and girls. So let's look at them on some of these climate disaster situations. Lori Allen and at least 98 others died in the Lahaina, Maui fires. A flaming branch crashed to the roadway ahead of Lori's car as she tried to escape. With the fire closing in, she knew that her only hope was to get out and run through the inferno. Miss Allen eventually emerged, running into a firefighter who enveloped her to extinguish the fire. Despite a valiant effort to save her, Lori died 7 weeks later in the hospital. Over 8,000 residents lost their homes, and increased housing costs have meant most cannot rebuild. The recent bushfire in Australia had thousands flee their homes. Alice and her family were one of over 30,000 people ordered to evacuate. Firefighters have been battling a bushfire that started February 29th in the rural town of Bangdean, about 118 miles west of Melbourne, and spreading, according to the state's emergency department. The Texas Smokeout Creek fire is the largest fire in Texas and second largest in the United States.
Wow.
Strong winds resulted in over 1 million acres being destroyed by fire. Sheila is one of very few women firefighters, and she is here searching schools and towns to make sure no one is trapped. In Africa, food crops were destroyed by fires. These two sisters are trying to save whatever they can from crops that they were working for, of course, very small wages. They will now have no income and no food for their homes since the crops were destroyed. Judith is what is called a casual worker, meaning she is paid by the hour. However, her daughter Claire has asthma. Whenever Claire is sick, Judith cannot work, so she is not paid. Not only does she lose income, but she could be replaced at any time on the job. Ranji from Indonesia is covering her face, trying not to breathe the smoke from the fires. Agricultural land spiraled out of control, deeply affecting air quality for over 28 million people in Southeast Asia and afflicting respiratory illnesses in about 140,000. Sally and her dog are running in New York, which is reeling from smoke from the Canadian fires. New York City had the world's worst air pollution for days, harmful smoke wafted south from hundreds of wildfires burning in Quebec in 2023. Wildfire smoke contains very tiny particulate matter, or what is called PM 2.5, the tiniest pollutant, yet also the most dangerous. When inhaled, it can travel deep into lung tissue and enter the bloodstream. It comes from sources like the combustion of fossil fuels, dust storms, and wildfires, and has been linked to a number of health problems, including asthma, heart diseases, and other respiratory illnesses. Bernadette Grant feels like she's been in transition since the Paradise Fire. Her apartment burned, as did her mother's home, which had been in the family for 50 years. Morning Star Galley is seen at Vista Point Park in Napa, California in July. She is a member of the Ajombawai band and said she could not participate in a traditional ceremony at Medicine Lake this year because of the low water level. Wildfires ripped through Phoenix, Oregon, burning hundreds of homes and businesses. Marcy Barlow returns to the wreck of her home for the first time. In 2022, there were 1,714 deaths related to extreme heat and 76 deaths due to wildfires globally. Over 228,000 people were forced to relocate due to wildfires in the US. 7.58 million acres of land were destroyed. In 2023, there were 645 deaths related to extreme heat and 310 deaths due to wildfires. In Maui, over 14,000 people had to relocate. And in Paradise, California, everyone, the whole town was destroyed. 2.7 million acres were destroyed. Next, I give this to Angela.
Thank you, Joanne. I do a lot of traveling. Oh, go back, please. I do a lot of traveling, and one of the things I've noticed is how many times I'm going over a bridge that used to cover a creek or a lake. And I challenge each and every one of us to be mindful of how many fresh water sources we see evaporating in our midst. We see these, we pass these, and many times we don't give a second thought to the fact that that is a disruption to everyone in the whole ecosystem up and down that is now dealing with a dry riverbed. Next slide, please. With the dry riverbeds, we see the increase of drought. anytime we experience a prolonged period of no moisture, the water tables recede. They go lower and lower, and that's when we see the cracked earth, the parched, the challenges that we have. Every time the water tables drop very low, we have an increased problem with water pressure and consequently our fresh drinking water. Many of us remember the events in Flint, Michigan, and many of those people are still using bottled water today, as is Jackson, Mississippi. When these kind of situations affect a whole town, that too increases the water or the cost of requiring the moisture we need for our bodies and increases the strain on those that are already strained financially. This becomes a catch-22 that none of us have any control over. Next slide, please. The drought conditions continue to act severely in our nation. As you can look across the slide there, California, Kansas, and Iran, you can see how the water tables have continued to drop for our groundwater. And this has huge impact on us. One of the things that many of us don't remember to pay attention to is when our local economies start talking about new businesses coming in. We're going to give all these tax breaks to a company, as in Exxon Oil in Corpus Christi. They're putting in a brand new plastic plant. Well, their consumption of water is 25 million gallons a day. And so when you start looking at water-strapped areas and see a decrease of available water to support a plastic plant, that creates conditions that many of us are not prepared for. We watch the weather and we see how the snow falls, and many of the southern parts of our country here are reliant on that snow in the winter to feed the water in tributary lakes and streams in the summertime. We're seeing less snow across the nation, which then is that trickle-down effect of less water down the road. Arizona is now facing the newest big tech challenge of AI and the impact of AI on the water. Most people don't realize it takes 9 liters of water per each kilowatt hour of use for the computers. And as we put in more AI banks, that water requirement is only going to go up. So now, a bit of trivia. How many gallons of water does it take in the full process to produce 1 2-liter bottle of soda? The answer is 132 gallons. That's a lot of water consumed for production of 1 2-liter bottle of soda. Next slide, please. So then what happens to the excess water? We've dealt with the dry land, we've been through a drought, and now we have those torrential downpours that we get to see throughout the spring and summer. Well, when the ground is that dry and that hard, those hard rains have no opportunity for the ground to absorb it. So then we have just the massive runoffs, and we have then the opportunities for more flooding. Well, with that runoff comes the decrease or the increase in the nutrient runoff, and then the opportunity for algae, which then exasperates the stress that our crops are already dealing. So when you have those situations going on, then we see the increased salinity in the water. What happens with all the salt content? Well, it affects every aspect of that plant's development. That increase in salt limits the plant's ability to uptake the water. In many times in cases, killing the plant, leaving the bare soil, which then takes us right back to the erosion that we see when we're dealing with the drought. And with that, I am going to pass it to Connie.
Great. So now we're going to take a brief look at how heat affects what we eat. Heat does affect the quality of soil. Plant roots are less able to compensate for varying levels of soil moisture within the soil profile. When soil temperature rises above an optimum threshold, plant water and nutrient uptake can be impeded, causing damage to plant components. Extreme air temperature coupled with extreme soil temperature can cause varying degrees of damage to different parts of plants. And next, we're going to take a peek at food security. Food security does result in decreased crop yields. The rising temperatures and carbon dioxide concentrations may increase some crop yields, but the yields of major commodity crops such as corn, rice, and oats are expected to be lower than they would in the future without climate change. Great, now I'm stuck again. I'm going to do what I did before because it worked. Okay, there we
There it
go.
is.
All right. Climate change can affect food availability, access, utilization, and the stability of each of these over time. Constrictions at any point can lead to food insecurity through the activities of the food system, including food production, transportation, and storage. In the United States, this is already occurring. It is the reason for less choice and supply and higher prices. Inflation is not the primary reason for rising food prices. Note that. Okay, so we are now at the point of the program where we're going to have some Q&A and a little discussion. There's two questions that we're going to discuss, but we're going to take them one at a time. And the first one is, what are some of the heat-related issues in your region? I'm going to stop share. I'll repeat the question. What are some of the heat issues in your region? And Daniela is going to monitor the chat, or if you'd like to share by raising your hand, that's fine too. Either way, but do unmute yourself if you choose that route. So, what are the heat issues?
This is Barb Swartzel from District 15, Metro Detroit area. We've certainly had a lot of flooding that's impacted particularly our low income and longer term established communities, and that's an issue. But we have also had algae blooms in Lake Erie that have shut off safe drinking water to the entire Toledo region. This last year it wasn't so bad, but other years, you know, they've had days literally where they could not get fresh water, and sometimes over a period of weeks. So those are both really key issues in this part of the country. And the Great Lakes supply a huge amount of fresh water for the world. It's a source of great water, and we need to protect them. I mean, other regions would be really glad to tap into our water. I'm sure that new plant in Corpus Christi would just love to run a pipeline from one of the Great Lakes down to supply their plant.
Could be.
Carrie?
Yeah. Hi, I don't know how to raise the hand on the thing, so I raised my own hand. Anyway, well, in Arizona, obviously extreme heat and lack of water are problems. A lot of the newer communities being built have more water restrictions on them, but a lot of older communities are kind of grandfathered in. But the lack of water, they have to also, we've joined with California and Nevada, I believe it is, to monitor the water coming from the Colorado River. And because that's our main supply of water, fresh water. So there's a lot of issues that way. And last summer was just unbearable here. It's like I lived inside the whole summer, and it's already 95 degrees here. And this is what, April 21st. There's more to come.
Harry, are there populations that don't have air conditioning in your
In it-
area?
Probably, I would think so. A lot of places, instead of air conditioning, they have swamp coolers on the roof. And I guess it's kind of moisturized, cooler air. But that's probably why Arizona has so many cooling stations across the region. So it's a full 3-column page of locations that I printed off for the cooling stations and so forth.
Those are sort of emergency shelters. I mean, you can't go to them every day when you have a job or
No,
you have.
well, hopefully if you have a job, it's in air conditioning.
Mhm.
So
So Terry, this is Angela. Do you have a lot of manufacturing? My experience has been, when you've got a lot of warehouse work, a lot of times that is not air conditioning. I
yeah.
know being in the military, we were always mindful of the wet bulb. And I think some of the states are just starting to pass wet bulb requirements when they allow farm workers to seek shade as opposed to working through. But I would good know in your area, is there a requirement for air conditioning in warehouses, and how does that work in Arizona?
As far as I know, we have a ton of warehouses. They're everywhere now. They're like exploding. And I don't know about the air conditioning. I would assume because they're huge buildings that they would be very difficult to air condition, depending on what the product is. So they're also limited on their water. But the state also relies on all these warehouses to improve the roads. Otherwise, if you got a pothole in the road, it's going to stay there until you get a business that comes in and fixes it.
I think Karen had her hand raised.
I was just going to say, I live in the Chicago area, and we were shocked last year when the Canadian wildfires affected our air quality for several weeks. And then there was a second time, and we didn't see the sun. We didn't have a normal sky. It was red. You could smell the smoke sometimes. And a lot of people who have breathing issues had issues,
Yes.
increase their asthma and increase their other respiratory issues. That shocked me. We just for days said it can't be from Canada. It's got to be something else. But it was from Canada. So what happens
Yeah.
in the world affects other places in the world. And
That's
so
right.
I think that's part of what we all need to keep in mind too.
The other thing I was thinking about with the wildfires is particularly in California had a couple of towns were wiped out.
Yeah, paradise.
So it's more than just wood that's burning, more than just trees that are burning. We have buildings and metal pieces and all kinds of other things that are burning. And the military has just recognized that the burn pits that they established in the Gulf War has created all kinds of cancers. So I'm
Right.
wondering if this, wildfire explosion is also going to start causing cancer as well as respiratory illness.
Probably.
When we think about what we're talking about, the particulate matter and carcinogens and everything, I'm sure studies will show in the next, 10, 15, 20 years. We do have a few questions. I think kind of going back to Terry. So one was, what about all of the outside workers who are often low income? And then also to dovetail on that, what about the indigenous population living on tribal lands, which we know are very hard hit with poverty? What is done to help them, especially in like Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, those states?
Okay. Well, I think that, well, for one thing, I noticed in the hot weather, especially a lot of the outdoor workers, they start earlier in the morning. And I think that's why Arizona does not go on the daylight saving time, but they start earlier and hopefully get out, hopefully get done before the hottest part of the day. A lot of them, once it reaches like a certain degrees, 100, I don't know, maybe less, they have to quit working. I think it's a law or something. I'm not very knowledgeable about the laws there, but yeah. And the indigenous population, I don't really know anything about that. They're on their tribal, if they're on their tribal lands, I don't know that we have any, what's the word? I don't know that we can tell them what to do because they're on tribal lands. They have their own law. They're considered separate nations.
So I'm
Well,
gonna, oh, go ahead, Angela.
I was just going to say, and my information is slightly dated, but I know a lot of the tribal lands owned the water rights coming out of Colorado,
That's
and
right.
they have been selling some of those water rights back. And at one point, there was an interesting bidding war, which was putting money back into the tribal nations' pockets on the use of the water rights. I don't know where they are now. I don't keep up as well with what's going on in Colorado's water basin, but that's just one of those things that, we start seeing more and more about what's going on with the basin and where's the water going.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that answered her question, but that was the last
Yeah.
information I had.
It's my mom asking that question, so I told her I will find the information out for
Well, there are 19 federally recognized Native American tribes just in Arizona.
Yeah, there's like 30 in Washington. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
Oh,
Yeah.
It's wild. So I want to shift to the other question. I'll just read it because I don't want to shift back and forth. It's just easier. So the other question was, what small task can you do to begin to take action? So just think about that a second. And if anybody has any reactions, either in the chat or raising your hand.
Well, just occurred to me as Terry was talking that she said she doesn't know what the law is as to what temperature you have to stop working outdoors, I guess. We should try to investigate our laws a little bit in our own local community, if there are laws, or if we think there should be laws that aren't there. Because we need to think about ultimately trying to make legislative change that benefits
Yes,
women
that's
and
right.
girls in climate situations.
I agree. I know a little bit about that in Washington. It's ridiculously high. It's like 95 or something like that before they get breaks. So it is, I mean, there is a group of people that are trying to get that changed, but we can be looking for opportunities to support that when it comes up in our legislature. So I think that's a great idea.
So I just Googled that, and Google says
Mhm.
only 4 states, California, Washington, Oregon, and Colorado, have heat rules that apply to farm workers.
Oh, wow.
And they're
And
not
so
they're not low enough. I mean, they're not good enough is what
Right.
yeah. And um, in California, indoor workplace, but it doesn't talk about outdoor workplace laws. And I know from being in the military, a lot of it was all wet bulb. At what point does the heat rise to the point that you've now set yourself up for the possibility of heat stroke or heat illness, heat stroke,
Right.
and that would vary, and that was tied to the humidity in the air. So, if you had a big downpour, like when I was in Louisiana, every day at 2 you had a dump of rain, and at 3 you were feeling like you were in a sauna.
Yeah.
And my soldiers would drop quickly. So it depends too on where you're at. But yeah, I agree, Bobby. We need to be more mindful of, especially in our farming communities, that we have laws on the books that protect them.
Yeah.
Yes.
And to go off of that too, just to give you an idea, in the Northeast, we are seeing that rise in temperatures, especially we're having a lot more increased hot summers than we were in the past and those heat waves. And we don't have those in place because, you know, it's a short period of time, but I live close to Saratoga and they are thinking more about the horses, and we love horses and everything. They're thinking more about the horses than they are about the track farm workers. A lot of them are low income migrant farm workers, and their rights are often the last thing to be thought about in extreme heat. So it's a definite issue around the nation.
Yeah.
Great. So with that, I am going to take us back to share screen. Let's see, hold on a second, bear with me.
Oh,
'Cause
we
we've
do
got-
have one more question in the chat too.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Barb said one, she was stunned about the amount of water it takes to create the soft drinks. And then two, what about laws to add water usage to produce foodstuffs to the packaging labels? Anyone want to answer
Not
that?
a bad thought.
Barb, I did Google the water, and if they've added water to the packing procedure, it has to be listed on as an ingredient.
Mm.
So I don't know. You know, I did find that out from my friend Google. So I'll tell you what, I Google everything, it seems like these days.
Well, if
So
we
as-
if we
Go ahead.
have laws that mandate all of that nutrition information, could we not just add to the authors, to those laws that, you know, X amount of water was used to produce this box of cereal, or
Mhm.
this can of soup, or,
Right,
I
right.
mean, the requirements are already in place for some other things.
That's true.
I imagine it would be hard to get the food labelers to include the water, because when you talk the total process, so many times, you know, at first I wasn't thinking about all the water for running the equipment for in the production process. And so that the soda for me was a big eye opener.
But I
think-
bet it's true for a lot of other things too.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
and particularly, I think with the increase in computer usage and AI now, which is threatening to quadruple or balloon in terms of its use. I think that uses a lot of water to run those computer.
9 liters for 1 kilowatt hour. And so, you know, that does start adding up quickly. And I don't know how many computers can run on a kilowatt hour. You know, I don't have that breakdown, but I just know more and more. And again, I'll go back to my military time. When the computers first came out, and we would run the trucks out with our computers on there, you know, keeping them cool was critical, because once they went down, you lost all your communications in the field.
Right,
And
right.
so that's why at one point everybody wanted to work in the IT department, because it was always air conditioned.
Yeah.
All right, so I think we will shift to our last set of information for all of you, which is what Zontians can do. And Angela is going to take us to the end here.
So what can we do as individuals and family as we prepare for our extreme heat days? The first thing we can do is actually prepare. Do we know how and where? Do we have we updated our fans? Have we checked our flashlights and prepared for losing power because of heat issues? Do we have our emergency kits? Do we have a backup plan if we have medication that needs refrigeration? Those are all issues that happen. You know, how much food do you need on hand? If you lost power, how long can you go with the food that you have in house? I know myself, I keep a couple of cans of gas for my grill. If I have prolonged outage of power, I'll be doing a cook fest because I've got food in the freezer. You know, it only lasts so long. So being prepared is probably the biggest thing we can do to help ourselves. And talk with your neighbors. If you have neighbors close by that you know are elderly, How are they doing? Do they have a safety net? My little lady friend who across the street was 92. She had no family here. She had one nephew left in her whole family line. And so we neighbors all pitched in and kept a very close, watchful eye on Miss Jane. Is your home weatherized? Can you weatherize it? Do you have a lot of gaps and leaks? I know when I look at the folks that have plastic over their windows, and you wonder, you don't have air conditioning, obviously, and now you've got plastic. You may have a box fan, but what can you do to weatherize and protect yourself? And then if there is prolonged heat, where can you go for relief? My go-to spot's the library. I make no bones about it. I can spend hours there. But it's close. It's a little long for a walk if I had to, but it's still, know where you can go. Next slide, please. Community action. When our Zonta Club joined forces with the Kentucky Resource Center, that was a real eye-opener for us to recognize how unaware we are when we start seeing the legislation about new businesses coming to town. So being able to recognize and ask, what are the resource requirements? Because I know on the last two bills that came through the Kentucky Resource Council, that was one of the things that they addressed is nowhere on the bills did it reflect what the resource usage was going to be. So we had no way to prepare. How much water are you using? Are you trying to take over wetland areas that we need for our own erosion protection? And that was one way that we can all re-engage in our communities and look at what is happening. The heat-related illnesses, that tends to be very localized. I know in Louisville, Kentucky, we have a pretty solid process for where they look for the standing stagnant water, which is the breeding grounds for the mosquitoes. And again, we talked about awareness for community resources and infrastructure. Our club has been handing out little fans. We do these little pop-up fans and hand out because it does help protect from the sun. It does give you a fan. And we're including these in our emergency kits that we provide to a local community, especially the shelters and the area called locally here that supports women that are unhoused. That's where we provide the information packets, like I said, which include the little fans. And you can set up a heat hotline. I'm not aware that our community has one, but I will be looking into that as we move forward. Next slide, please. So club actions. We have addressed a number of issues at hand that clubs can take on for any topic. I think one of the biggest one to be aware of is what is happening legislatively in your community. Once an organization moves in and starts consuming your resources, it's real hard to stop that consumption. But if we can be mindful of what that consumption requirement is and raise the pertinent questions when we're in that decision-making opportunity, we will do much better. Local resources, supports, and infrastructures. I know, again, my local area, it gets very vocal about where they can go for cooling stations. But I think as we become more and more aware, it's much easier for us to hear and then be able to be a spokesperson for what the community has to offer. Next slide, please. Next slide, there we go. So here are some of the resources that we have. I encourage everyone to go to zontausa.org or to Zonta International, Zonta Says Now, and look at the resources. We have flyers already available that clubs and everyone can use locally as they address with people how to prepare for the issues they have at hand. Next slide, please. And with that, I would like to thank each and every one of you for attending today. as we continue to host our USA Caucus Gender Equal Climate Action Committee. I think we will be working to include climate justice. If you pay attention to the news, you're starting to see more and more states are looking at legislative action for climate justice in their communities. We will be working on our next think tank for in the fall. And our focus for the next biennium will be reduce, reuse, repurpose, and respect our resources. Again, I thank everyone and look forward to seeing you all on our next think tank.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. No one's gone yet.
Okay. Bye-bye.